Welcome everybody to another Rackspace Cloud Office Hours. We have got a great show for you today. We're joined as usual by my co-host Alan Bush. How are you?
I'm doing as good as I can. I've lost my voice a little bit, but that's why we have two hosts.
That's exactly why we have two hosts. We try to do this in parallel as much as we can.
High availability.
Exactly. Thank you for joining us despite that that sore throat, and hopefully the tea or coffee that you're drinking helps to soothe that. And if you need to pitch in via Twitter, we're looking forward to you doing so. The topic today that we're going to cover is containers, and that's been a huge topic over the last probably 12 to 16, 18 months. Stuff going on around this conversation earlier than that, but things really seemed to be snowballing since then. And we wanted to talk a little bit about what containers are, the tools and the ecosystems around them, how they're useful, things to be aware of and to know about in that space. So we've got some experts with us today. We've got Jason and Simon, both Rackers who have been involved in a big announcement that came out earlier this week out of the OpenStack Summit in Tokyo about Carina and one of the offerings that we are launching here on our OpenStack platform. So if you want to get involved in the show, there's a few ways to do that. We have Twitter. Give us a shout on hashtag CloudQA, and we have the interaction through Crowdcast and through Google+. So shoot us questions as we're going. We've got experts on today to make us sound a lot smarter than we are, because we need people who have that deep expertise to do so. But let me shoot it to you guys to do some quick introductions. Jason, how about you give us a little bit of background on you?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Drew. Thanks for and Alan. Thanks for having us on today. Looking forward to the discussion and the questions. My name is Jason Barnhill. I'm a almost 4-month Racker, so joined this summer, and I'm part of the public cloud product marketing team and have been working closely with Simon on our containers offering. About an 8-year veteran of technology marketing. Spent time at Dell, among other places, and looking forward to the show today.
Well, thanks for joining us. Simon, let's hear a little bit from you.
Yeah, hey everyone. My name is Simon Jakesch. I work as a product manager here at Rackspace, responsible for containers, which would also make me the product manager for Carina. Super pumped that the release is finally out. We can talk about it more openly, and it's no hush-hush anymore. So really looking forward to the conversation here.
Well, thanks for joining us, both of you. I think that there's plenty to talk about on every side of this discussion. But let's start by kind of setting a baseline. So a lot of people have probably heard about containers, be it through Docker or some of the other tooling around containers, but Simon, why don't you share a little bit about what containers are and what makes them so exciting?
Yeah, so containers have been around for a long time. They have existed for the better part of 10, 15 years for sure. I think the resurgence of this technology has all been thanks to Docker specifically, and kind of their workflow that they've wrapped around it. The reason why everyone is really excited about them is that it really solves a critical problem that many people had so far, and it's basically the packaging of their application. Right? So all of the benefits around making them available more quickly and reliably, that's what people get so excited about containers.
I think that reliability and repeatability is a theme that the cloud has really brought to the forefront, and then just having the mechanisms through which to do that more easily and more effectively have been pretty huge. So yeah, that's a lot of the buzz and the value around containers. Could you talk us through a little bit of the ecosystem, some of the key components in leveraging containers well?
So the ecosystem, right? The ecosystem was as we know it today, really has been generated or created by Docker. So a lot of tooling has been created around kind of the container format itself. A container by itself is just an image or a set of files, essentially, that then obviously has to be moved into place on a host or a virtual machine or somewhere else. So there's a lot of tooling that is required around orchestration. The familiar types of tools come up, Ansible, SaltStack, and so on and so forth to do that. There are specialized container orchestration engines that kind of coordinate the running of multiple containers. Mesos, Swarm, and so on and so forth are examples of that. Kubernetes is definitely also a big example of that. And then you have different pieces that you start tying into your applications that are somewhat new. I'm thinking of discovery services, etcd, various things from other vendors that basically allow you to discover and for the containers to discover themselves. So there's been a rich ecosystem around microservices and containers that has been generated and popping up over the last, as you said, 12, 16, 18 months.
Yeah, and it seems with increasing volume and momentum, and not just volume in numbers, but the louder and louder proponents of these sorts of technologies have just really taken the spotlight in a lot of ways. And it sounds, from all of the social media and blogosphere type buzz, that's really what a lot of the excitement is, this Carina announcement. We actually have a question from David in the Q&A app, and I think a lot of the tooling and the parallels from this conversation kind of lead into that one. So let's talk about that for a minute. So David asks, why not just install Docker on existing Rackspace cloud servers? Why Carina? So I think I'll let you cover that, but I think the tools has a little bit to do with why that might be a value proposition one way or the other.
And when you say I'm assuming you mean me? Yes. Okay.
Yes. Either one of you, Jason, Simon, both.
Jason, you want to take this one?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to start, and Simon, feel free to chime in with any additional key points. But for me, the value that Carina brings is being able to provide users, whether they're developers or operators or other customers, the infrastructure, the environment already pre-built, that's managed, that's updated on a regular basis for the customers to build, deploy, and run their container-based applications. So because this is still a new technology that's very early on in the technology diffusion life cycle, a lot of the tooling that Simon has described that are required to kind of build the environment that you need to run containers effectively, still relatively primitive. Even sophisticated users and experienced users can have challenges getting things to work exactly right. And then there's also the rapid evolution in this space of the technologies and the features. So every time that Docker releases a new feature set or a new release, you'd have to go back in and essentially recreate your environment from scratch. And so one of the key value props of Carina is just simplicity. We, as the experts at Rackspace, do that for you. So you don't have to worry about any of the infrastructure. You just get in and run your containers and build your application the way you want to. Simon, anything to add?
Yeah. So I think I probably want to add the fact that yes, absolutely, you can very easily use Docker machine and actually install, Swarm on top of Rackspace servers. As kind of Jason has already explained, that will create I believe, a maintenance nightmare over a longer period of time. Also, I think, and this is something that people will catch on over the next 2 to 3 years, is these environments, like the Swarm environments and the Kubernetes environments, they will essentially just become like another OS image. So the question really becomes, do you actually use a lot of self-uploaded images? Do you load a lot of your images, very particular images, into the Rackspace cloud that you then run, or do you just consume images that actually Rackspace provides? Right? My guess is that your consumption of images actually is all around the pre-built images, and then you customize them. And so Carina takes that step. And then lastly, and most importantly probably, is the fact that the backend that Carina runs on currently is not something that is virtualized. So we're actually running Docker Swarm on top of containers on top of bare metal. And so you're essentially not paying for that virtualization penalty that you would otherwise pay. And our tests and benchmarks have shown that that actually speeds up and gets you better performance up to 60%. So lots of reasons why you would want to use Carina instead of rolling your own on top of Rackspace Cloud.
I think that gets into a pretty interesting conversation that comes up often when there's any sort of an as-a-service or platform style conversation being had, and that's how much control do you want / need, and how much expertise do you currently have or need to build. There's nothing stopping people from using containers on top of Rackspace cloud servers. That actually happens quite a bit throughout our customer base. But they have certain things in place, and they're taking on certain responsibilities, like maintaining that environment, that takes cycles. And they may feel more comfortable with all of that control, but that may not be the best case for everybody. And having someone else handle all of that frees up that time and those cycles to go towards something else. And so that's kind of a refrain you'll hear often at Rackspace is, let us handle those tasks so that you can focus on the business itself. There's no roadblocks keeping you from doing just what you proposed, which is running Docker natively in Rackspace Cloud, but there are benefits to both. And so having that conversation around priorities and around what your business needs and the tools you currently have, how quickly you need to be to market with a new feature or a new platform or a new approach, that's going to play into that conversation. So this type of thing comes up in a lot of different corners of Rackspace. This is just one of the leading technology conversations. Containers specifically is just one of the ones that's more quickly developing and more on the edge. So thanks for covering that question. That was very good. Stuart has a question as well, and Alan, do you have that?
Yeah, I do. So Stuart was asking, can containers be used in hybrid technology platforms, or is it only cloud-based? And we've already basically started answering this, but let's talk a little bit about the different ways that you can run containers, and then kind of the way that Carina itself is running on bare metal.
Yeah, so I think if we go back 5 years to kind of the start of OpenStack, right? I think one of the core premises that people had or hopes was that this hybrid story would be much more prevalent, that people would run OpenStack privately and then they run it publicly, and there would be just this seamless, you don't even know where your stuff runs anymore, you just kind of like direct and it just magically happens. And while there's certainly a set of people that have perfected it this way, I think the majority of people have found that that hybrid story really never got fully developed, simply because the images are too big, the tools that we had in place took too long, and so what I really to kind of move those workloads and to configure them and customize them. So what I really believe is that containers essentially represent our first chance to actually truly get to this hybrid scenario. If you look at tooling like Kubernetes, if you look at other things that people have done, for the first time people are actually seeing those like those those rumored live cutovers, right, where you are upgrading an application in place and you're all of a sudden draining, from one version of your app to the new version of your app, and everything is seamless. And while that existed before, containers and Docker specifically, it was very rare that people had perfected the tooling that existed to actually that level of degree. So I think containers have really strengthened the hybrid story, which another indication of this is to actually, the rise of bare metal, right? The rise of bare metal is thanks to containers, because for the first time, it is much easier to say, hey, this really hardware-intensive application, or part of my application, I want to run on bare metal, but this other not so hardware-intensive application that may require massive scale down and scale up, I want to run on some virtual or some instrumented virtualized layer.
Yeah, I would just add a couple points, one of which we touched on kind of implicitly, but just to call it out specifically, part of the vision of Rackspace and containers is to be able to offer choice, whether it's choice of venues, public or private, choice of compute services, as we've talked about. There may be certain workloads that a user prefers to run in a virtualized environment. Others, they may be more comfortable running within containers on bare metal, as Simon described. And still others may want the consistent performance benefits of a dedicated environment, such as on metal or even our dedicated business. And what we really want to do, starting with Carina and then building out, is to be able to offer that choice to users, to customers, whether it's choice of the tooling that you use, as Simon touched on, Docker, Kubernetes, Mesos, others, or the choice of form factors or cloud platforms. And we want that choice to be really user-driven, right? So we're early on in the technology of containers, and we want the users in the market to kind of help tell us which way to go to support their needs. And I think this aligns very well with Rackspace's overall vision to enable great service and support on the world's leading technologies. That's all we're doing here. It's just taking the leading technologies within containers, making them available to our customers.
And that's what we're going to continue to do as technology advances, as it is inevitably going to do. I'm going to take a minute, since we've got some new viewers who have joined us since we launched, and there's some additional questions we want to cover. If you would like to ask your own questions, we have a few ways to do that. You can tweet at us with the hashtag CloudQA. You can join us on Google Plus and ask questions through the Q&A app. And then if you're watching on the live.oh podcast, Crowdcast, you can ask us questions there. So please give us your questions as we are moving through this conversation, and we have some container experts with us. We'd really appreciate to start that conversation of kind of waiting for the market to tell us. Let us know what you have questions about. Let us know how you would like this conversation to go. But we do have one question I want to cover, and that's from Tyler. And he brings up a point that we discussed in brief last week around managed security, but what kind of security issues arise when using containers?
So that's a very broad question, right? I think so. Rackspace, as I said before, as I've stated before, so apologize. As I stated before, we have the benefit of actually a set of compute portfolio, a whole compute portfolio. So unlike many other providers, we don't just have one-trick ponies, right? So we have on metal, we have virtual machines, and now with the addition of Carina, we actually have containers as compute backends as well. And so I like to put those things in terms of kind of how Adrian Otto put it in the technical deep dive to Carina as well. Each of those have a place in terms of security, price, and performance. And so really it's not so much about, I think, for example, that virtual machines are kind of like the El Caminos. Do you know what an El Camino does? It's a a sedan in the front and a pickup truck in the back. It's not
either one perfectly, but it does some of everything.
Right, and so it's not a very good car. It's not a very good pickup truck. It kind of does everything, right? So a virtual machine falls squarely in that purview, right? It's not particularly fast. It's not overly safe, but it is very good on kind of a general use case scenario. And so when you make choices around containers, there are certainly security situations I could, really deep dive, and the listener is happy to ask for a deep dive. But then you really have to kind of factor in what is my workload? How sensitive to security is that workload? What choices do I have to make? Do I have to put that workload on a single compute instance like an on-metal where I'm the only person on that instance and I know so? Is it something that is kind of medium, that requires medium security? Then I put it on a virtual machine. And if it's something that really I'm already publicly pushing out it anyway, like a front end that serves up content or something like that, then then that's definitely something that could work very well in a container. That's kind of the first take I would do on the security side of the house.
And I would probably add to that, just thinking more macro from the market in general. If you think about virtual machines, virtualization as a technology and a market that's been around for the better part of a decade or more, right? We're still in the very early stages of the commercialization of containers. And so you just haven't had as many developers and other smart folks working on security solutions for containers. And so I think just as containers evolve and mature as a technology, the security will go right along with that. And in 5 years or less, probably we won't really have much of a debate on security. It'll just be, as Simon mentioned, what other features of the workloads that you want to run. Some may work better in virtual machines versus containers, but security may not even be a topic of discussion because we've gotten that good as the technology and the market has matured.
Yeah, security is always going to be a conversation around an arms race. There's going to be new things developed on both sides of that security fence. And so I think, really to Simon's point, knowing your workloads, knowing your tools, knowing your architecture is the best way to approach a security question. Where does the most focus and attention need to be placed, and how do I parse out my priorities so that I'm not spending $1 million on securing my web front end when the most important stuff is in the database, and so on and so forth. You just need to have a clear idea of where to spend that time and effort, and containers will certainly be part of that conversation. Well, thanks for the question, Tyler, and thanks for helping us out in addressing it. And we've got a few more rolling in here. So this is a good question from Matt that kind of gives a good getting started 101, which is always a great place to be in these early phases. So Matt asks, which is better to start with, Kubernetes or Mesos? And that's an opinion probably, but let's get your takes on that.
I don't think there's any general that I can't just give you a single word answer on that. I think it's very difficult to do. In the end,
that's fair.
Right. So in the end, it really depends on what does your application look like, what does your skill sets look like, what have you been using in the past. What I find, for example, is that Mesos works very well in combination with either another cloud platform or even Swarm. And so they work very well together. Whereas a Kubernetes is a very prescriptive kind of, so if you want to think of Mesos as another tool in the Unix pipeline, right, where you use Docker and then you use Swarm and then you use Mesos, and all of that is piped together, and you can kind of combine your own workflow. Kubernetes, on the other hand, is extremely technically sophisticated, but at the same time also has a very strong point of view on how your application should be run. So it's very prescriptive, right? So it really depends on your personal preferences, your workflow, what type of technologies you're using. It's a very difficult question to answer. So yeah, I would say depends on your application, depends on your team, depends on your preferences.
Are there any
could you give us maybe a key strength of each?
Yeah, so Mesos is very easy to understand, for example. Super easy to set up, works basically seamlessly in conjunction with tooling that already is in place that is kind of the next step, right? Kubernetes, on the other hand, has a much higher learning curve on Kubernetes is much more so than with Mesos. So I would say that if you have a very sophisticated application that runs, or a very sophisticated team that runs one application only, and that application is kind of the core of your business, then Kubernetes is definitely a good choice because it deals with a lot of those web app style patterns very well. Whereas if you have an application that may actually have nothing to do with serving content, or you have just a set of applications that you're running out of your IT department, or something along those lines, then Mesos might actually be better for you.
Okay, that's really helpful. You talked a little bit about the ease of use, and in the press release and everything that we're reading about Carina, I saw some evidence that a 10-year-old is able to use Carina. Could one of you kind of share a little bit about that ease of use and how Carina was built, with getting started being a big underlying proponent of building that out?
Yeah, so I think Carina is certainly targeted. So actually our ease of use choices actually just began way ahead, right? So we actually chose consciously Swarm because it's a very nice transition for people that have started using containers, that are becoming familiar with what it means to run a Docker host or to run a Docker engine. And so really Swarm actually is just like a big Docker engine with a couple of extra concepts of other different segments or different nodes. And so it's a very smooth learning curve. There's no, it's just a very natural extension to becoming and using containers. We always knew that with Carina, we really wanted to bring containers to kind of a broader market, to people that haven't used them yet, or maybe aren't familiar yet, or haven't transformed their applications to use them yet, that kind of stuff. So that's why we chose Swarm. And then really everything else just came naturally. The platform, we wanted it to make it really easy for our own purposes, really, to get this going and to really create an environment where, having a Swarm is like having a virtual machine, or having just, you have different types of environments. They're really quickly and easy stand up. And so people can stop bothering and worrying about with infrastructure and configuring servers and choosing things, and just right away start deploying their application in a format that is 100% compatible and they can move very easily.
Just to add on to that, not only is it easy, it's fast, right? So you can get up and running on Carina in as little as 45 seconds. Whereas if you compare that to a do-it-yourself approach using a lot of the same tool sets outside of Carina, it's upwards of 5 minutes. And for those of you who want to literally see a 10-year-old do it, go check out the keynote from the OpenStack Summit in Tokyo. There's a video link on the Summit page where Adrian Otto, who's our distinguished architect, is 5th grader. Gets up and running on Carina for the first time in less than a minute.
That's some fun stuff to watch, and that was definitely one of the big buzzed about components of that keynote. You mentioned the speed of utilizing Carina, and we've talked about previously the fact that speed is one of the reasons. Speed of deploying is one of the reasons that containers themselves are really catching on. Alan, since his voice is shot, has been pitching in his questions via the text form. So he sent us one that we'll address now. How does using containers speed time to market, and how are developers using containers to improve their workflows?
Well, so I'm not going to be saying anything new. I think I'll just wrap up. There's no like additional. In my point of view, I've been living in this ecosystem for some time now, right? And it's very difficult to say anything net new. But I'll definitely repeat kind of the things that have been pointed out in the past. So the core, and this is what Docker has been doing very well, and I think that's why they're so loved by developers, is that they have never violated that work, or they basically perfected this. I'm developing on my own system right here in front of me, and now I am taking this very same application that I've just worked on, and I'm now moving it into the next environment, be that a testing or pre-prod or even the production environment. That is something that in this form simply has not existed. And Docker has managed to streamline and perfect this mechanism, that problem of like it worked on my workstation, but now it doesn't work in production, is basically solved.
Now it's ops problem.
Right, now it's ops problem, right? So it's definitely a mechanism, it's definitely a movement that has been adopted by developers, because there's been a lack of this type of tooling, and the tooling, not just the containers, but the tooling that exists around it, right? So we're talking about Docker Hub and all of the other, supplemental tooling that help developer, Docker Compose, all of those supplemental things that basically developers are adopting, has given developers not just one way of doing this reliably, but so many ways of doing this reliably that we never had before.
Yeah, and so in addition to just smoothing out the workflows and making it easier for developers, I think more macro from a business lens, this really increases your ability to get to market faster and just your agility, right? So if you think about just containers as a technology, being able to spin those up in literally fractions of a second can make your website much more responsive to spikes in traffic, for instance. And so, when you cut the time it takes to scale up and down from minutes to seconds, or even fractions of a second, that can result in huge benefits for companies that need that level of agility and being nimble in order to respond to demand in their markets.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, there's a conversation. Go ahead. I wouldn't want to talk over you, Alan. Okay, I'll keep talking over you. So I had a conversation with a friend of mine who used kind of the analogy of pixelation and how screens have been going from whatever res they were when I was watching TVs as a kid to really, really high def, those 4K crazy TVs, and we've seen the kind of conversation happen in the IT world. You had big monolithic physical infrastructure that got smaller and easier to deploy, and then we got into virtualization, and that allowed you to deploy even faster and smaller components and follow that growth curve a little bit tighter, and then we have containers that are able to be deployed as efficiently as possible and really even smooth out that curve even further, and smooth out that picture so that you have these tiny pixels now that are still, doing the same thing, creating an application that provides an outcome for a user, but in a smaller, more easy to deploy, more clear way. And so that's kind of the vantage point that I've looked at this from. But Alan has a question that goes from there. What does the future contain? Sorry, I just saw that I said that. I didn't mean to. In containers, what does the future hold for us, maybe in the next year or 5 years from now?
Yeah, so that's That's a very good question. So the way I see this, and I don't know if I've mentioned this in here before, but just to kind of take a 30,000-foot view for people. Just like what we've been seeing 15 years ago when VMware first came to the actual play field and introduced the world to virtualization, and everyone was just like, this is amazing, this is incredible. For the very first time, I can actually just ask for a piece of hardware, push a couple of buttons, boom, I can install any operating system on it and make it really easy to consume. So virtualization made it very easy to consume hardware. What we're seeing at the moment is that time, but for applications. So 10 years ago, we saw this with hardware. Now we're seeing this happening with applications. So the way I look at this is applications will become more available, more rapidly available. They'll merge and become more highly available. Outages will, further reduce. Reliability on apps will improve, and it'll be easier for people to bring up software as a service offerings, and everything will just be so much easier to consume from an app perspective. And the container orchestration engines that we're talking about today, I like to refer to them as actual application hypervisors. And so those types of things that people basically feel very emotional about as of 3 years ago. I prefer ESX, or I prefer KVM, or I prefer Hyper-V. That's the same discussions moving forward. People will feel very emotional about their container orchestration engines with, I prefer Kubernetes, or I prefer Mesos, or I prefer Swarm. And so that's really kind of the way I see it, right? We'll be moving up the stack. We're moving away from making hardware easy to consume, and actually moving to where it matters most, to making applications more easy to consume.
Yeah, I would add to that. I look at it as really part of the democratization of technology, right? And so if you look back at the history of technology, if you think about moving from kind of mainframes in the 50s and 60s to personal computers in the 80s, to the internet and servers, to virtualization, to even just smartphones today. I think each of those leaps has made technology more accessible to everyone, and I think that we'll see a similar leap with containers, as Simon mentioned, making it easier for more and more users to access applications. So very, very exciting times.
Well, you mentioned the ease of consumption, and that leads right into Alan's question here about adoption. So with being on the front edge of container adoption, what might be holding back more users, especially the big enterprises, from taking mass adoption of this technology? Jason, what do you think about that? I know you just finished kind of alluding to it, so maybe begin to that.
So I think it's some of the things that we've touched on a little bit, right? This is a new technology, so say large financial institutions and banks, right, that process a ton of very secure, privatized types of transactions, probably aren't going to be rushing to move all of their billions of financial transactions every day onto a relatively new and still somewhat unproven technology. So to me, it's that's one of them. Is just this is still new technology, still being developed, and so I think there's just the natural risk aversion to it. And then there's also cases where like other technologies, not everything is right for containers, right? There's plenty of legacy applications that are built on legacy architectures that it wouldn't make sense to transition over to a containers-based environment. But I think for anyone who is just starting out working with applications, anyone who is a cloud-native type of organization already, containers makes a ton of sense for kind of all the reasons and benefits that we've outlined so far. Simon, anything to add there?
No, I don't think you've covered most of it. Yeah, I think to summarize, it's definitely a lack of knowledge. People are still lagging behind with understanding the technology. This will basically take probably a good 3 years to actually have a mainstream type of, everyone knows it, everyone agrees that this is the best way to do it, and that kind of thing. So yeah, that's the way I see it anyway.
Yeah, new can be scary for sure. Even if people are proving that it's doing a great job, it's hard to trust that you will do the great job when you jump in the first time. I think that's compelling. David has asked an additional question, and this really digs into some of the guts of Carina. So let's get into that and see where we can go. How does Carina decide when to scale, and how does it, or what's the balance between throwing raw power at one container and scaling horizontally to spin up more segments?
Yeah, so this is almost daily changing properties that we have there. So I don't know where it stands at the moment. I invite you to take a look at the Carina site. I'm pretty sure there is either on the FAQ or there's a specific tutorial talking about autoscaling as well. Just to give you kind of a perspective on this feature, it's really our first experimentation with the feature. Where ideally we don't actually want to have this be even a discussion point. What we want Carina to be essentially become is a compute resource pool where people don't even have to worry about that part. They simply deploy into the pool a set of containers. If they have to over deploy or over provision by 3x or whatever else they want, then they can do so. And then both, it will actually not have a significant impact on their wallets, as well as any spike will have no significant impact on the availability of their app either. That's kind of the goal. I am hesitant to give into much detail because that would actually talk about the very particular roadmap plans that we have. But it is definitely an exciting proposition, and I have found that when I started those conversations and kind of started floating the idea that it will oftentimes catches people in like, oh yeah, you're right, this is the way it should be. So for now, we're just simply looking at memory and CPU consumptions, and you can provide us scheduler hints. So if you wanted to say, hey, I want to actually go and add an additional node here, instead of using the GUI components or the CLI tool, you can actually just say, hey, I want to reserve this much memory or this much CPU for this piece of my container or workload, and then Carina will actually come around and automatically scale your resource up. For the most part, that's how it works. And I invite you, looking for scheduler hints, looking for auto-scaling on the Carina site, either in the FAQ or a tutorial, is you can test and educate yourself further.
Well, thank you. I don't know that we have Jason for much more time today, but Jason, thank you for joining us. If you have any closing thoughts, we'd be happy for you to share those with us.
Yeah, thanks again for having me on. This has been a lot of fun. I've certainly enjoyed it. Apologies, I got to leave a little bit early, but I think for me, really exciting to be a part of getting Carina launched and a part of this next wave of technology democratization, as I mentioned, and really excited for what the future holds for containers in general, and specifically the opportunity for Rackspace to be a leader in this space, which is hopefully you've heard a lot of reasons why Simon and I are excited today, and reasons why we believe that This is a great space to be in, and the opportunities in front of us as a company to go establish a leadership role here. So lots of exciting stuff. Hopefully Simon and I did a good enough job here, Alan and Drew, to get invited back, and we can chat some more next time. So thanks a lot, guys. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Jason. We'll definitely have you back soon.
Thanks, guys.
See ya.
Thanks for joining us. Well, with a little bit of the remaining time, I think it's important that we at least discuss how someone might get involved in that beta for Carina. So looks like Simon has a link there under his name on his little banner. So Simon, why don't you share a little bit about getting started with Carina, what somebody might do as maybe a test run of using that tool?
Yeah, that's very straightforward. As you can see, you can just enter your email address and a password right away. And after you do that, you'll actually just get a confirmation email as usual. You click on the link. There's one more step where you provide us a cell phone number, and we'll send you a PIN, and you enter the PIN as a confirmation as well, and then you're ready to go. There's literally no other steps. If you wanted to kind of get some guidance on how it actually works, I invite you to look at the documentation portion, and there's a particular section called Getting Started. Kind of look over the overview, and then kind of the second article in there, it talks about specifically getting started with Carina. So that's actually the second one, yes, and it just walks you through the entire process. I think it's so intuitive that, and it's always difficult to say this from my point of view, but I believe it's so intuitive that very little reading is actually required, and someone should be able to kind of, our benchmark was to create, to go from no account and nothing on your laptop to running cluster with an ability to deploy your first container in 5 minutes. So creating an account, downloading the appropriate client bits and all of that is basically 0 to 5 minutes of effort.
I noticed
all
there's
right,
also
and for the
a
time
command line tool. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Which tool?
The command line tool.
Oh yeah, the command line tool is really, so obviously since this is targeted at developers, they don't have an appreciation for web GUIs many times. Maybe nice to do it once, but then really if you want to use it in your workflow, it's nice to have a tool that you can trigger from your command line. And so the command line tool really is all about a really quick and easy way to create your clusters and interact, set settings, scale them up, and then also download the credentials and right away start using them alongside the Docker client to start using it. So, and one thing I want to highlight here is that this is unlike many other services that kind of wrap the entire user experience, including the deployment of the containers and the management of the containers and all of that, into a third-party command line tool. We have always emphasized very heavily that the native tooling, handing off to the native tooling as soon as we can, is definitely kind of the key focus for us. And so that's why we've kept that command line tool very lightweight. And we're actually thinking of contributing a lot of what we've worked on upstream to include it into Docker Machine longer term. And so people at the first touch point, they can move to the tooling that they're familiar with and that they use on their local laptop to also interact with Carina remotely as well.
All right, there's another question that's really around interfacing with Carina specifically, and this might be an interesting one for other current Rack customers. David asks, Carina creates a new login. Will it be folded into the main Rackspace site, or is it spinning off into its own ecosystem? So I read that does it map to an existing Rackspace account as well, or is it going to remain standalone?
So the account that you create is actually the minute you created a Rackspace account. It's not usable in any of the other properties that Rackspace has. So as a result, we actually encourage you that if you already have a Rackspace account, to just use that account on Carina as well. That means you can just use the same credentials and the same account across all the Rackspace properties. The accounts that you currently create on Carina are not useful on any other Rackspace properties simply because they don't have any credit card credentials attached to them. We're soon adding an ability for you to enter your credit card credentials on Carina as well. Don't worry, that does not mean we will start charging right away, but simply because we also want those people to be more seamlessly moving between the properties and start adding maybe a load balancer for their app on Carina or something along those lines. But both accounts could be used interchangeably in the medium term.
So you mentioned that that it's free currently, and so the reason we're doing that is to gather feedback. How would we get feedback from our users, and how is that interaction best, I guess, accessed?
Yeah, so we encourage, currently the primary way of providing us feedback is through the forums. So we have forums on Carina, community.getcarina.com, or they're just directly linked there as well. We're very much looking forward to feedback. We'll also be looking to include more details on feedback within the product itself, kind of in the medium term. Yeah, but any feedback at the moment should go towards the forums, and we'll address anything there and collect it.
So that's feedback for the products, features, bugs, etc. There's also, it looks like, support available through that community. So as more users are interacting with Carina, as they're finding unique solutions and unique use cases, they'd be sharing that there, and we've populated that with a few of the rackers who helped build that. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, this was definitely a team effort across all of Rackspace. We've had involvement from developer experience group, which took basically all of the responsibility of the front end. We had core engineering involved that was basically responsible for all of the back end. It was really a cross Rackspace effort to bring this to market for sure. And there was another part to your question, right?
No, I thought I had unmuted myself and I hadn't quite done so yet. Yeah, so as you mentioned, there's been cross-functional work to get this launched, and there's going to be a lot of additional work to bake in lessons learned and bake in the feedback that we receive from everyone who ends up using. So please go and kick some tires on Carina. Get some experience, get some reps using this tool, and let us know what you think, because it gets better as we learn from you and as we learn from the ways that the tool gets used. So I think that covers a lot of what we have time for today. I'd love to do a deeper dive into some of the nuts and bolts of Carina, especially as we move from beta into full-on production, and as we take those lessons learned. It'd be great to share those back out into the community, as there's so many people learning so much. We're going to get a very distilled view at this particular juncture in containers growth, but specifically around Carina. So Simon, thank you for your time. Thank you for your expertise. We wouldn't have been able to cover a topic like this without someone with the background that you have.
Yeah, thank you for having me
so
on.
Thank you so much for. Yep. We're glad to have you. For all of those watching, thank you for joining us. For anybody who's watching this in the future, hopefully you're not too far in the future and you can enjoy some of the additional shows we have planned. I know the holidays are coming, and that's going to throw a kink in the schedule, but we do have quite a bit scheduled throughout the rest of this year. Next week, we're going to be talking with Racker vets, veterans of our military and people who have come from those backgrounds to really infuse Rackspace with a unique and wonderful culture when we're talking about the Racker values and where they come from. And in a couple of weeks, we're going to be live from San Francisco talking with New Relic at FutureStack and getting a lot of insight into where New Relic is growing and how customers can use their tools. So we've got quite a bit to talk about here in the next few weeks, and we'll be talking about Carina a little bit deeper later on. So thanks everyone for watching. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you guys next week.
Thanks everybody.
Thank you. Take it easy, guys. Bye.
Feel better soon.